The file arrived at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., placed on my desk without a word. It was thick, heavier than most operational briefs, and marked with a classification stamp I had only seen twice in my career. The impact rattled my coffee mug, and when I looked up, Colonel Harrison was standing there, motionless, his face drawn tight with something I had never seen before: hesitation. Harrison was not a man who hesitated. He had served through the final years of the Cold War, watched entire programs disappear overnight, and carried secrets that would never make it into official histories. If he looked uneasy, it meant the ground beneath us had already started to shift. "Conference room," he said quietly. "Bring no one." That alone told me this was not routine, not missing persons, not training exercises. This was something that lived in the shadows between military authority and historical denial. He locked the door behind us. Inside were 3 men in civilian suits who did not introduce themselves: an Army intelligence analyst I recognized from classified briefings, and Major Brooks from Special Operations, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. The atmosphere felt heavy, as if the room itself understood the gravity of what was about to be said. Before anyone spoke, Harrison slid a non-disclosure agreement across the table. It was longer than most divorce settlements. I signed without reading it. At my level, hesitation was not an option. The analyst dimmed the lights and brought up a satellite map of eastern Kentucky. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the terrain was rugged, isolated, and historically forgotten. A red circle appeared over a location labeled Copper Creek. Official records showed Copper Creek as an abandoned coal town, sealed in 1978 after a fatal mine collapse killed 15 workers. The company dissolved shortly after. The town was declared unsafe, uninhabitable, and eventually erased from active maps. On paper, Copper Creek no longer existed, but the satellite images told a different story. There were maintained roads cutting through terrain that should have been reclaimed by forests decades ago, buildings with intact roofs, vehicles parked in orderly rows, and most disturbing of all, power usage patterns consistent with long-term human occupation. Brooks spoke next. 3 weeks ago, a federally contracted geological survey team went missing in this area. No distress signal, no emergency beacon, no remains. That alone would have raised concerns. But then he added the detail that changed everything. Thermal imaging showed approximately 40 heat signatures within the settlement, 40 people living in a town that, according to every federal, state, and county record, had been dead for over 40 years. Harrison leaned forward. "We believe this may be connected to a series of thefts from military convoys. Over the past 18 months, weapons, communications equipment, cold weather survival gear, all taken within a 200-mile radius of Copper Creek. This wasn't a criminal gang. This was organized, structured, disciplined." I asked the obvious question. "Militia?" No one answered immediately. "That's the problem," Harrison finally said. "We don't know, and in military operations, unknown variables are the most dangerous ones." The mission was simple on paper: reconnaissance only. Confirm who was living in Copper Creek. Locate the missing survey team if possible. No engagement, unless absolutely necessary. But before we adjourned, Harrison stopped me at the door. "There's more to this place than we're allowed to tell you," he said quietly. "Copper Creek sits on ground the government has been watching since the Cold War. Whatever's happening there now, it didn't start recently." As I walked out of that room, one thing was already clear. We weren't being sent to investigate a ghost town. We were being sent to walk into a piece of history that someone had tried very hard to bury. The Appalachian Mountains have always been misunderstood. To most people, they are just ridges and forests, coal towns and folklore. But to anyone who has studied American military history closely, Appalachia represents something else entirely: a region where geography, isolation, and poverty made it perfect for secrecy. During the Cold War, the U.S. government quietly transformed large portions of Appalachia into a shadow zone. Radar relay stations were carved into hillsides. Emergency bunkers were hidden beneath abandoned mines. Entire communities were displaced under the justification of economic decline or environmental hazard, when the real reason was classified infrastructure that could not exist near civilians. Copper Creek fit that pattern too well to ignore. As we prepared for deployment, intelligence briefings filled in details that never appear in textbooks. In the 1950s and 1960s, Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia were riddled with covert federal projects. Some were officially energy-related. Others were never acknowledged at all. Declassified documents from decades later revealed that abandoned mines were routinely repurposed as storage facilities, listening posts, and contingency shelters designed to survive a nuclear exchange. That history mattered because places like Copper Creek were never truly abandoned. They were simply erased from public awareness. By dusk the following evening, my team and I were airborne. 5 of us, small footprint, no unit patches, no identifiable markings. This was not a flag-waving operation. This was an inspection that was never meant to exist. We inserted miles from the target zone and moved on foot through terrain that punished every step. Appalachia doesn't welcome outsiders. The slopes are steep, the ground uneven, and the forest dense enough to swallow sound. As we advanced, the silence felt unnatural. No distant roads, no town noise, not even the usual wildlife movement you expect at night. That absence told us something was wrong. By the time we reached the ridgeline overlooking Copper Creek, night had fully settled. What we saw through optics confirmed every fear intelligence had raised. Lights controlled, disciplined, and purposeful. This wasn't a squatter camp. This wasn't scavengers or survivalists. The settlement below was organized with military precision. Guard posts were positioned for overlapping coverage. Patrols moved in timed rotations. Radio checks followed consistent intervals. Someone down there knew exactly what they were doing. As we observed, a shift change occurred at midnight. 6 guards rotated out. 6 replaced them. No delays, no confusion. That level of discipline doesn't come from YouTube tutorials or hobbyist training. It comes from experience, military experience. That realization changed the mission entirely. This wasn't just about stolen equipment or missing civilians anymore. This was about trained personnel operating an unauthorized compound on U.S. soil, something the federal government takes extremely seriously. Then we noticed something else. Near the northwest edge of the settlement stood a reinforced structure. With a newer roof than the others, guards posted there didn't face outward. They faced inward. They weren't defending the town from intruders. They were guarding people inside. That's when we knew the geological survey team was still alive. Historically, Appalachia has always been a place where authority fractures. During the Cold Wars of the early 20th century, armed groups fought private companies in the mountains. With military tactics, during Prohibition, entire enforcement teams vanished chasing bootleggers who knew the terrain better than any outsider. Even during Vietnam, draft resistance networks hid men in these same ridges for years without detection. Copper Creek felt like the modern continuation of that pattern. People who no longer trusted the government. People who understood logistics, discipline, and secrecy. People who had chosen the mountains because the mountains protect their own. As we watched from the ridge, one thing became painfully clear. Whatever was happening in Copper Creek wasn't accidental. It wasn't recent, and it wasn't going to end quietly. This settlement had been built deliberately, maintained carefully, and hidden expertly using lessons learned from decades of forgotten American conflicts that never made it into the history books. And now 5 soldiers were about to step into the middle of it. We waited nearly 2 hours on the ridgeline, watching Copper Creek breathe in the dark. From above, the settlement looked calm, almost ordinary but calm like a coiled spring. Every light switch, every patrol step, every pause between movements followed a pattern. Whoever designed this place understood surveillance as well as we did. That told me something important. This was not desperation. This was planning. The Appalachian region has a long history of people building parallel systems when they believe the government has failed them. After Vietnam, after the Cold Wars, after factory closures hollowed out entire counties, veterans returned to mountains that offered no jobs, no care, and no future. Some disappeared quietly. Others formed networks legal at first, then increasingly gray, then invisible. Copper Creek felt like the physical manifestation of that history. Signals specialist Rodriguez worked his scanner, slowly mapping infrared trip lines and motion sensors. They weren't improvised, they were placed with intention, covering approach routes that matched standard military doctrine. Someone had studied perimeter defense formally. "There's a drainage channel," Rodriguez whispered. "Old infrastructure. Might let us pass under the sensor grid." Might was the best we were going to get. I left Sergeant Thompson behind on the ridge as overwatch. The rest of us descended, moving carefully through thinning tree cover until we reached open ground. The ditch was colder than expected, rust-stained concrete, stagnant water, and decades of runoff collecting in a narrow channel that smelled of iron and rot. We slid in, without a sound. Crawling through that ditch was slow, miserable work. Mud soaked into our sleeves. Sharp edges scraped skin through fabric. Every movement felt loud in my head, even though we barely made a sound. At one point, a guard's boots stopped directly above us. A rock dislodged and fell inches from Reeves's hand. No one breathed. When the boots moved on, we continued. The ditch led to a culvert beneath the outer fence. Old, cracked concrete. Forgotten infrastructure, exactly the kind of thing abandoned towns are full of. We emerged inside the perimeter, crouched in the shadow of a structure that had once housed mining equipment and now served as cover. From there, the prisoner building was visible. We moved like ghosts, staying in blind spots, timing our steps between patrol rotations. Inside the building, the locks were industrial grade but old. Reeves clipped the padlock with bolt cutters. The metallic snap echoed louder than it should have, but no alarm followed. The hallway inside was narrow, utilitarian, no decorations, no signs, the kind of place built for function, not comfort. The third door opened to reveal the survey team, 7 civilians, thin, exhausted, alive. One man lunged forward in panic before I covered his mouth and whispered who we were. Relief flooded his face so fast his knees buckled. 3 weeks held without explanation. 3 weeks of not knowing if they would ever leave that building alive. They told us they had stumbled into something during their work, nothing supernatural, nothing impossible, but something classified. Reinforced tunnels beneath the old mine, equipment that didn't match any commercial operation, and men who reacted with fear rather than curiosity when the team asked questions. That detail mattered. Fear means someone is protecting something they don't fully control. We were halfway across the compound when floodlights snapped on. White light swallowed everything. Rifles appeared from shadows we hadn't known existed. Red laser dots settled on chests, arms, faces, perfect spacing, perfect angles. We were surrounded. An older man stepped forward, calm, controlled, and unmistakably military in posture. Civilian clothes, soldier's bearing. He introduced himself as Morrison. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't rush. "Lower your weapons," he said evenly. "You're outnumbered. And your radios stopped working 5 minutes ago." Rodriguez confirmed it with a slight shake of his head. Morrison wasn't bluffing. He explained that Copper Creek wasn't a criminal operation. It was a refuge built by veterans who had been discarded after service. Men and women who understood security, logistics, and survival because the military had taught them well, and then left them behind. He admitted to the thefts, to the secrecy, even to detaining the survey team, but he insisted they were protecting something the government had abandoned decades ago, and something it would destroy again if rediscovered. Appalachian history supported that claim more than I liked. When Morrison offered us 1 hour to see what they were guarding, every instinct told me it was dangerous. But tactically, we had no other move. Sometimes history doesn't give you clean choices. Sometimes it forces you to step forward whether you're ready or not. Morrison didn't take us toward anything dramatic or theatrical. There were no speeches, no grand gestures. He simply turned and walked toward the old mine entrance at the edge of the settlement, moving with the confidence of someone who had walked this path many times before. That alone told me this wasn't improvisation. Whatever he was about to show us had been planned for years. The mine entrance looked exactly like the historical photographs. I had studied collapsed timber supports, rusted rails, warning signs from the late 1970s still bolted to rock. On the surface, it matched the official story perfectly. That was the point. Once inside, the truth began to peel away. After the first 100 meters, the old wooden supports ended. They were replaced by reinforced steel beams stamped with manufacturing codes from the early 1980s. Fresh concrete lined the walls, industrial lighting hummed overhead, powered by cables routed cleanly through the rock. This wasn't restoration, this was repurposing. Morrison explained that in the late Cold War period, the federal government quietly converted dozens of abandoned mines across Appalachia into contingency infrastructure. Some were emergency command shelters, others were storage sites for classified material. A few were designed as continuity of government facilities meant to survive nuclear exchange. Much of this is now public record buried in declassified documents that few people ever read. What wasn't public was Copper Creek's specific role. In 1978, the mine collapse that killed 15 workers was not caused by structural failure. Morrison said the collapse occurred after the mining operation broke into a sealed tunnel that didn't exist on company blueprints. The workers weren't killed by falling rock alone, they were exposed to a pressure rupture from an underground chamber that had been deliberately hidden. The government sealed the site within weeks. Families were paid, records were closed, the town was declared unsafe and erased. What followed was a classified project that ran quietly into the early 1990s. Federal engineers reinforced the deeper chambers. Power lines were installed. Monitoring equipment tracked seismic and electromagnetic activity in the surrounding rock. Not because of anything mystical, but because the chamber sat at a geological fault convergence that amplified underground signals in ways the military wanted to study. In short, Copper Creek became an experiment. When Cold War funding dried up, the project was abandoned without cleanup. No decommissioning, no dismantling, just sealed doors and silence until Morrison and his people found it again. We reached a rail platform deep inside the mountain. Old mining carts had been replaced with modified industrial carriers running on restored track. The ride down felt longer than it should have been, spiraling deeper into rock that grew colder and denser with every meter. Morrison spoke calmly as we descended. The government knew this place was dangerous, he said, not because it was supernatural, because it proved how fragile our control really is. The tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, not ancient, not alien, but undeniably man-made on a scale that should never have existed beneath a forgotten town. Concrete platforms, equipment mounts, data terminals long stripped of hardware, but still wired into the rock. This was a Cold War site that never made it into the archives. Rodriguez checked readings. Electromagnetic interference is still active, he said. Residual. Amplified by the surrounding geology. Morrison nodded. He explained that the chamber sat at a rare geological intersection, where natural magnetic fields intensified signal transmission. During the Cold War, the military studied it as a potential communication relay that could function even during atmospheric disruption. That research was never completed, but someone had come back. Morrison's group, mostly veterans, engineers, former contractors, had spent 2 years restoring portions of the site, not to weaponize it, to understand it, to preserve what had been left behind before it was sealed and forgotten again. They believed the survey team had triggered renewed interest from federal agencies, and that history was about to repeat itself. Standing there, surrounded by evidence of a buried operation that officially never existed, I understood the fear that drove them, because this wasn't speculation. This was how American history actually works. Discover something inconvenient, classify it, seal it, erase it, and if someone stumbles onto it later, deny everything. As Morrison finished, one truth settled heavily in my chest. Copper Creek wasn't hiding a myth, it was hiding a pattern. And we were standing inside proof that the past doesn't disappear, it waits. We didn't hear the helicopters at first. Appalachia has a way of swallowing sound, bending it, delaying it until it's too late to pretend you didn't know what was coming. It was Morrison who noticed the change, his head tilted slightly, like an old soldier recognizing a familiar threat before it fully reveals itself. Federal response, he said calmly. They moved faster than last time. That sentence carried weight. Last time meant precedent. It meant this wasn't the first buried site that had been rediscovered and quietly reclaimed by the state. We moved back toward the surface in heavy silence. No one spoke. because everyone understood what federal involvement meant. Once official forces arrived, control would shift instantly. The narrative would be written before facts could be debated, and whatever didn't fit that narrative would vanish behind classification stamps and legal walls. When we emerged into the open, Copper Creek was already changing. Armed units moved through the settlement with practiced efficiency, securing buildings, separating people, disarming residents without unnecessary force. This wasn't a raid. It was a containment operation, the kind the government uses when it wants something sealed, not publicized. Historically, this playbook was familiar. In 1947, when unexplained materials were recovered in New Mexico, the story changed overnight. In the 1960s, when underground facilities were exposed during mining operations in Nevada, the sites were purchased, sealed, and reclassified. In the 1980s, Cold War installations were erased. By redefining them as abandoned industrial hazards, Copper Creek was now entering that same category. Morrison stood in the open as federal agents approached him. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He knew the outcome before it arrived. Men like him always do. Veterans learn early that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet endurance. He kept his word. The 7 surveyors were released to us without hesitation, alive, unharmed. That fact alone complicated the legal case against him more than he probably realized. I reestablished communication with command. Colonel Harrison answered almost immediately. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. All civilians accounted for? He asked. Yes, I said. 7, alive. There was a pause, and the situation, contained, I replied. But, complex. That was the most honest answer I could give without detonating a political bomb. Over an open channel, as helicopters descended and armored vehicles secured the perimeter, Morrison was placed in restraints. He didn't speak. He didn't try to justify himself. He knew. Justification doesn't matter once a narrative has been chosen. But I noticed something others didn't. Several members of his community vanished into the surrounding forest during the confusion. They moved without panic, slipping into terrain they knew intimately. Appalachia has always protected those who understand it. During labor uprisings, prohibition, and even the Vietnam draft, people disappeared into these mountains and were never found again. History repeats itself quietly. Back at Fort Campbell, the debriefings began immediately. Hours of questioning, every detail dissected, every movement analyzed. They wanted operational date numbers, layouts, weapon counts, command structures. I gave them everything they asked for. Everything except one thing, I said. Nothing about the underground Cold War infrastructure still intact beneath Copper Creek. Nothing about the reinforced chambers or the electromagnetic anomalies. Nothing about the implications of what had been preserved and rediscovered. And my team followed my lead, not out of fear but out of experience, because history had taught us exactly what happens next. The official report would state that Copper Creek was an illegal armed settlement run by disgruntled veterans. The thefts would be documented. Morrison would be charged. The civilians' rescue would be celebrated quietly, and the site itself would be reclassified, sealed, and erased once again. Just another forgotten footnote. But history has a flaw. It relies on silence, and silence, we were beginning to realize, is never permanent. 3 weeks after Copper Creek was officially resolved, a file appeared on my secure terminal with no sender ID and no routing history. That alone made it unusual. Secure systems don't lose fingerprints unless someone with deep access wants them gone. The subject line was blank. Inside was a compressed archive, thousands of pages of scanned documents, engineering diagrams, budget requests, internal memos, and declassified fragments stitched together like a broken spine of history. As I started opening them, a pattern emerged that was both chilling and familiar. Copper Creek was not unique. From the late 1940s through the early 1990s, the United States quietly funded a network of underground facilities across Appalachia, the Ozarks, and parts of the Rocky foothills. Some were publicly acknowledged continuity of government bunkers. Others were never officially named, hidden inside projects labeled as geological surveys, mining safety research, or seismic Monitoring initiatives. These sites shared common traits: proximity to fault lines or unusual geological formations, existing industrial cover such as mines or tunnels, remote terrain with declining populations, plausible deniability if something went wrong. Copper Creek checked every box. One memo dated 1983 caught my attention. It referenced electromagnetic amplification properties within Appalachian rock strata and discussed potential applications for hardened communications in the event of atmospheric nuclear disruption. Another document detailed unexplained equipment failures during prolonged underground exposure, malfunctions that engineers could not replicate. Above ground, then there were the closures. Sites abruptly sealed, budgets cut overnight, entire programs reassigned or dissolved. Official explanations cited redundancy, cost inefficiency, or strategic realignment. Unofficial notes, often handwritten in margins, told a different story. Unstable readings, behavioral effects, reported among staff, recommendation, seal and classify indefinitely. I wasn't supposed to see any of this. What unsettled me most wasn't the technology, it was the consistency. Across decades, across administrations, across agencies, the same decisions were made again and again. Discover something underground, study it quietly, lose control of it, bury it physically and historically. The archive included references to at least 9 sealed sites that no longer existed on any public map. Some were destroyed outright, others were simply forgotten, left to decay beneath land that would later be sold, abandoned, or declared hazardous. This wasn't conspiracy. This was bureaucracy doing what it does best, protecting itself from uncertainty. I shared the findings with my team in fragments, careful not to move too fast. Rodriguez cross-referenced signal anomalies mentioned in the files with publicly available geological data and found correlations that should not have been possible. Jackson recognized equipment design notes that mirrored Cold War field hardware he'd trained with decades earlier. Reeves focused on medical logs describing psychological stress symptoms among underground staff: insomnia, disorientation, heightened anxiety. Nothing supernatural, just human beings pushed into environments they didn't fully understand. Then the pressure started. Unmarked vehicles appeared near my residence. Routine check-ins became less routine. Questions were phrased casually but carried weight. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Someone knew we were looking deeper than we should. That's when I understood the real danger of Copper Creek, not the site itself, but the pattern it revealed. If the government had buried this history once, and then again, and again, how many other truths had been lost not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient? History isn't always erased with force. Sometimes it's erased with paperwork. I realized then that what Morrison had feared wasn't paranoia. It was experience passed down through people who had seen the same cycle repeat. Discover, contain, deny, forget. The archive ended with a single declassified note from the early 1990s, written as Cold War funding collapsed. Certain discoveries are not threats, but they destabilize established narratives. Recommend indefinite suppression. That line stayed with me because narratives shape power, and power decides what history survives. Copper Creek was never just about a hidden settlement or stolen equipment. It was about who gets to decide what the past is allowed to be. History rarely turns on dramatic moments the way movies suggest. There is no thunder, no clear line between right and wrong. Most of the time, it turns quietly inside offices, behind closed doors, in the space between what is written down and what is left out. The call from Colonel Harrison came before sunrise. "Come to my office," he said, alone. No rank, no formal tone, just a voice weighed down by something older than this mission. When I arrived, he didn't ask me to sit. He stood near the window, looking out across the base as morning drills began below. Young soldiers running information, flags rising, the machinery of routine continuing exactly as it always had. He spoke without turning around. "I've read every after-action report from Copper Creek," he said. "They're clean, technically perfect, and deliberately incomplete." I didn't respond. Silence is sometimes the only safe answer. Harrison finally faced me. His expression wasn't angry, it was tired. the kind of tired that comes from carrying secrets longer than they were ever meant to be carried. You know, he continued, the Pentagon Papers didn't expose new crimes, they exposed patterns. That's why they mattered. That reference landed hard. Daniel Ellsberg didn't leak secrets because he hated his country, he leaked them because he believed the public deserved to understand how decisions were really made. The same was true of Chelsea Manning, of NSA whistleblowers, of scientists who revealed suppressed environmental data during the Cold War. People don't become whistleblowers because they want attention. They become whistleblowers because silence becomes heavier than consequences. Harrison told me something he had never put in writing. In 1987, as a young lieutenant, he had been part of a security detail assigned to a geological incident in Tennessee. What they actually secured was an underground facility, one not listed in any official archive. It was sealed within weeks. The mountain face was later destroyed under the explanation of natural instability. I watched them erase it, he said, and I signed the paperwork. He paused. I've regretted it ever since. Then he said something that changed everything. Leaking classified material is treason, he said flatly. But truth doesn't always align with law. If someone were to make certain information public, it would have to be done in a way no single government could stop. He didn't tell me to do it. He didn't tell me not to. He simply explained how it would have to happen: distributed releases, international academic partners, journalists across multiple jurisdictions, and timing after official investigations closed. He spoke clinically, like a man describing a bridge he would never cross himself but knew how to build. When I left his office, I understood the reality fully. If we stayed silent, Copper Creek would be sealed, reclassified, and forgotten like everything before it. Morrison would go to prison as a criminal, not a guardian of buried history, and the pattern would continue unchallenged. If we spoke, we would lose everything: careers, freedom, possibly our lives. That night, I gathered my team. I told them everything: Harrison's history, the archive, the pattern stretching back decades. I didn't try to persuade them. I laid out the risks plainly. Jackson spoke first. If we do nothing, this dies again. Rodriguez followed. The data isn't dangerous. The secrecy is. Reeves said the least, but it mattered most. I became a medic to preserve life. History matters because it teaches us how to survive. We poured a single shot of whiskey, not to celebrate, to mark a line. For the next 3 months, we worked quietly. We verified documents, cross-checked engineering diagrams with public declassified budgets, partnered anonymously with independent historians and scientists outside U.S. jurisdiction. We removed speculation and left only evidence: dates, locations, signatures, photographs, and patterns no honest analyst could dismiss. This wasn't a leak, it was a release. On the winter solstice chosen for both symbolism and timing, the archive went live. Simultaneously, universities, media outlets, research institutions, independent servers across continents. No single switch could turn it off. Within hours, historians began connecting dots long ignored. Cold War scholars recognized program names they had seen referenced, but never explained. Journalists uncovered funding trails that led nowhere until now. Governments issued denials, then partial confirmations, then silence. By the time federal agents came looking for me, the truth was already everywhere. History had surfaced again, and this time, it wasn't alone. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. History never resolves itself cleanly. It fractures, spreads, and settles unevenly, leaving consequences in places no one originally expected. In the weeks after the release, Copper Creek stopped being dismissed as a fringe story. Academic panels were formed. Congressional staffers quietly requested briefings. Declassified archives that had sat untouched for decades were suddenly being re-examined under a new lens. Not because the government had changed, but because denial was no longer sustainable. The pattern was now visible, and once people see a pattern, they cannot unsee it. Official responses followed a familiar progression. First came blanket denials. Then came statements that framed the sites as misinterpreted Cold War infrastructure. Then came acknowledgments that certain facilities existed but posed no lasting significance. That language mattered because it wasn't designed to explain the past. It was designed to limit the future. Morrison's trial never happened the way prosecutors planned. Defense teams introduced historical evidence tying Copper Creek to federal projects that predated his presence by decades. Former contractors testified anonymously. Documents surfaced that contradicted the government's timeline. Charges were reduced, sentencing delayed. Eventually, the case dissolved into procedural limbo, where inconvenient cases are quietly left to die. Morrison himself never spoke publicly. When reporters tried to find him, they failed. Some said he returned to the mountains. Others believed he left the country entirely. But those who had known him best understood something important. He never wanted recognition. He wanted interruption, and he got it. Across the country, independent researchers began re-examining abandoned sites once dismissed as industrial relics. Old mines, sealed tunnels, unsafe geological zones. Not with paranoia but with curiosity grounded in evidence. Most revealed nothing unusual. But some did, enough to confirm that Copper Creek had never been an outlier. As for me and my team, there was no dramatic arrest, no public trial, no martyrdom. That's not how modern systems punish dissent. Instead, we were quietly removed, clearances revoked, careers ended without explanation, future opportunities evaporated, administrative erasure. It hurt more than prison might have, because it was designed to make us disappear without making us symbols. Yet something unexpected happened. Historians began citing the archive. University courses referenced the case as an example of Cold War secrecy mechanisms. Journalists followed the paper trails further back into World War II, into early nuclear programs, into decisions made under fear and uncertainty. The conversation shifted, not toward conspiracy but toward accountability. Copper Creek became shorthand for something larger. The danger of burying truth, simply because it complicates power. That's the lesson history keeps trying to teach. Not that governments are evil, not that secrecy is always wrong, but that unchecked silence corrodes understanding. Years later, I returned only once to the outskirts of Copper Creek. The site was sealed again. New fencing, new warning signs, different agency names on the paperwork. But the land felt different, not exposed, acknowledged. People knew something had been there, and that knowledge mattered more than access, because the past doesn't need to be fully uncovered. To change the present, it only needs to be remembered honestly. History doesn't stay buried because it wants to be hidden. It stays buried because forgetting is convenient. Copper Creek proved that truth doesn't disappear when sealed underground. It waits in records, in memories, in patterns repeated too often to be coincidence, and eventually through documents, through people, through quiet courage it surfaces, not to destroy nations, but to remind them who they really are.